As Marcus said, I have been with Rugby Australia for 6 years, and part of that time was actually running and leading the AMS throughout Australian rugby, and it's quite a challenge. And listening to Lisa this morning and some of the problems that netball faced and rolling it out across their state-based teams, that sounded very similar to the problems that we had. It's always an evolving journey to roll out that athlete management system. And 3 years ago, I moved into a role with the Sevens program. And so that put me back at the coalface and working with athletes on a full-time basis, which is what I'm most passionate about doing. And it was really quite good to get back there and actually see that some of the things that we struggled with behind the scenes on rolling out an athlete management system, they actually did make an impact when we got out there, and some of the stuff like the wellness collection and just our injury surveillance reporting, some really simple things and nothing fancy, actually made a big impact in what was happening on the day-to-day. So that was quite nice to see. But today what I'm going to talk to you about is in the Rugby Sevens program, specifically in the men's program, we use our AMS for a range of reasons, similar to most of you guys in the room: injury and illness collection, and just recording physical testing and profiling our athletes. But what I want to talk to you about today is the final 4 things there, and actually looking at training load management, although I won't talk about that too much. I'm going to talk more around the monitoring of training and how we relate that to both a risk management perspective in terms of looking at the dose-response relationship to training from a physical perspective, but also how we're marrying that up from a performance perspective and whether or not we're preparing our athletes to play Rugby Sevens at the elite level. So what I want to talk to you about today, and hopefully you'll get from this, is some of our systems and processes we use to understand what we're preparing our players to do, as in what are they required to do in a game. Talk a little bit around the planning and periodising of our training, and I won't go into some real detail of how we plan a year, but more around some of the systems that we use to make some decisions in the planning process so that the decision can be made before the actual training session has occurred. In terms of the monitoring of training, as I just mentioned, talking about looking at a load, fitness and fatigue relationship, the interaction of those 3 factors, but then also comparing our training intensities to the worst case in matches. And then I'll briefly talk about some of our player availability and surveillance recording. So what are the players required to do in match play? If we think about over maybe the last 15 years of time motion analysis, and I know Marcus actually wrote a few papers on that through his PhD, we might be looking at an average of a half. In Rugby Sevens instances, or the average of a match, we might be looking at a general intensity speed of play 90 to 105, 110 metres per minute. But is that really what's required of the players? We don't think so. We think that in our game there's a lot of stoppages. So after a try has been scored, there's at least 30 seconds before the kicker has to kick the goal, and then a further 30 seconds before they have to restart play. So it's intermittent in nature, as most field sports are. There's work out there from, Grant Duthie kind of started with the moving averages, and some other guys, Tanner Scott and Jace Delaney, have progressed that work, looking at the moving average and what's required, whether that's in metres per minute or whether it's acceleration demands. What we wanted to look at, though, is that our game's not an 80-minute game, so potentially a moving average of the intensities wasn't as relevant. We wanted to know what they were actually doing when the ball was in play. Okay, and is that different when we've got the ball versus when we're defending, or when might be a change of possession? So with our links with UTS upstairs, we've got a PhD student, Mitch, and he went down a bit of a rabbit hole of looking at every single game we played in a season, watching the match video files, coding those files for 4 different periods of play. When we've actually got the ball for 30 seconds or more, defensively when we don't have the ball for 30 seconds or more, a ball in play situation where there is a change of hands but there's no stoppage whatsoever for 30 seconds or more, and then a situation where we might have a clustering of work to rest intervals. And what we use there, just so you have a definition of what that is a minimum 1 30-second work effort and then work periods on either side of that 30-second period until a 10-second period of rest had occurred. So we want to try and capture where there might be what's called like maybe a true stoppage. So for example, a penalty at the ruck resulting in a turnover. There's actually a stoppage there because there's a whistle blown by the referee, but the team might play on within 5 seconds. So we didn't want to exclude those periods where play was actually continuing to go, but there was a true stoppage. Once Mitch had gone through and looked at all those video files, we got timestamp data, he got the corresponding GPS data and then analysed each of those cycles for metres per minute and percentage high intensity running, which is, for us, that's above 6.7 metres per second, or around about 24 k's an hour. What do we find? So as I mentioned before, the average of a half, it runs about 90 to 105 metres per minute. When you actually look at when the ball is in play, almost 50% of the work intervals are around 145 to 185 metres per minute. So well above what we would actually think is required in the game if we looked at just the average of a half. Then when we broke it down and looked at, are there any differences between when we have the ball versus when we don't have the ball? You can see on the right hand side in that box and whisker, attack runs at a slower pace in terms of metres per minute intensity. Makes a lot of sense because we can control the tempo of the game. Defence on the far right, higher intensity in terms of metres per minute. Ball in play, so the change of possessions, is quite similar to defence, which again makes a lot of sense because there is a defensive component and an attacking component. Whereas a cluster with some intervals of rest runs at a little bit of a slower period or slower intensity. What about when we looked at the high intensity running demands? Did we see similar things? Well, we definitely didn't see the same distribution of that data. It's quite skewed to the left. And what we saw is that most of our ball in play situations, so when the game's actually going, there's low to moderate high intensity running demands. It's between 0 and 5% very high speed runnings. But there's also a lot of outliers. And if we look at the box and whisker over there, you can see how many values are not sitting inside the 50% proportion of that data and just sitting above. So that kind of indicates to us that there's key moments in the game where players are really going to have to exhibit a high percentage of high intensity running. So it's important to know this information because this might actually go, right, we might need to prepare our players in a different way to handle not just what is most occurring, but also what could happen in the worst cases. So what we then did is we're trying to draw that link between what's happening in the games to how we might prepare our players in training and trying to integrate that alongside the technical and the tactical preparation for our players. So what we did is we came up with a set of training standards which allow us to, for a certain duration of a training drill, so if on the far right there, from 30 seconds through to a 2-minute period, we set about a certain intensities, so metres per minute and percentage very high speed running for different types of drills. So we looked at, if on the far right, defensively, what we found in our analysis here is defensively it generally runs at 190 metres per minute and around about 11 to 13% very high speed running regardless of the duration of defence. In attack you can see it's far slower, and we've got a combination drill there, and the combination is not, it's not including cluster and ball and play. We've used that there because we generally don't train in a clustering type of way, but we might have drills where we have both a defence and attacking component. So that's our reference point for drills that are similar to that. So now we know a little bit around what's actually required in the game and what we're actually planning or got to prepare our players for. What we then set about to do in the process with our staff, with the head coach and our head of performance, is putting together the big plan for the year, and the athletic performance staff can go away and put together some details around periods of loading and tapering and so forth. And then we get into a bit of a process where we have that plan. That plan's distributed to the coaching staff. The coach can then plan his training alongside his technical and tactical outcomes he'd like to achieve. So hopefully we can have a bit of an integrated model with the physical being developed at the same time as the technical and the tactical. I know you can't read this, but what we then give to the coach alongside the plan is a drill database. He gets a little bit of a simpler version here, but what I wanted to show you guys today is that we break all our training drills down into some team-based drills, which are generally 7v7, played full field, maybe down to a contested drill, where the numbers might only be 4v4, 5v5, field size might be full field. Some skill development drills, so they're just technical drills. We're not trying to achieve any intensity in those drills. And then on the far right is our, I suppose, strength and conditioning type drills, our conditioning, our speed qualities, and also some game reference values in terms of averages. So what the coach gets here is the average locomotor demands of different drills that we usually do. Within that drill database, as I just mentioned, it's got the GPS parameters that are relevant to our game. It sits within Smartabase. So in terms of automating some of our processes around getting a training session plan, we can cross-reference what the coach has decided to do on that day with the periodised plan. So he gets a periodised plan on the right, real simple version here. He gets his drill database and goes, right, this week I want to focus on these technical and tactical outcomes. If we look up here in this table, we provided the coach almost like a framework and say, right, to achieve our physical targets for this point of our periodised approach in the week or the month, we would like to, or to meet those targets, we spend on Monday in week 1, 5 minutes in low intensity drills and 7 minutes in high intensity drills. And those high intensity drills are directly related to some of those worst case scenarios, being drills that are running at above 160 metres per minute. So the coach gets an understanding of what we're trying to achieve from a physical perspective and where we can marry that up with the technical and tactical. So as I mentioned, that sits within Smartabase. We get a plan from the coach. We've got all our individualised load targets and our monitoring information on each player. Basically pump the training session through Smartabase and what he's decided to do, which particular drills and for what duration. And this is going to pop out with a drill prediction, we call it, which is essentially the drills that we're going to do and the expected or predicted dose prescription for that session. And then we can break that down into the totals if you don't do any of the additional conditioning, the totals if you just do the footy components, and then the totals with additional conditioning. Just so before we get into the session, we have an opportunity that we don't get surprises and we can adjust particular players on an individual basis for each drill of the training session to achieve what we want for the group, but then also manage individual targets for each player. So that's probably, before we go into monitoring of training, probably what I wanted you guys to get from our planning of training is not necessarily the specifics of how we plan a year or a week, but more in that how we're trying to link and integrate what we're seeing in a game and then what we're trying to achieve in training to make sure we prepare our players. When it gets down to the monitoring of what we decide to implement though, we're looking really at two aspects. And what we like to focus our time on is looking at the relationships between load, fitness and fatigue as an approach to assessing risk and determining whether or not players need to do more or less or what their involvement in upcoming training sessions are. And also, as I mentioned, comparing the training intensity to what we're going to see in match play. So firstly, if we look at this load, fitness and fatigue model, this is generally, this is a schematic of what we're actually looking at there. The load, what are we actually giving as a dose to our athletes? And then the interplay between, fitness and fatigue. A lot of you will be very familiar with that type of model based on Bannister's type idea of, fatigue, mass, fitness and so on. And then hopefully there's a performance outcome. So going into our model and what we look at in the sevens program, from a load perspective, we look at our external load or GPS data. Fitness-wise, we have a weekly sub-maximal heart rate test, so looking at the athlete's sub-maximal or heart rate response to sub-maximal exercise. Both a fitness and fatigue measure is our counter movement jump, which we do on a weekly basis. We have a number of variables we look at, with primary ones being flight time, contraction time, and eccentric duration. And then from a fatigue perspective, looking at some wellness and soreness questions, along with some objective groin squeeze or adductor strength measurements. So there's a number of papers that have been published, a lot by Martin Bischeit, across different sports, validating the utility of a lot of these simple tests to observe and monitor the responses to training. So our approach to monitoring is heavily based on a lot of his work. I won't get into each paper or anything like that, but I suppose it's important to know that we haven't just picked any test, or we're actually looking at some things that have been validated in other sports. Part of the process is and around making some quick decisions on our players in the interplay between load and fitness and fatigue, is making sure we have our information really quite quickly. And one of the things we have been able to do through Smartabase over a number of years now is really speed up the process of that data capture and working its way through the system into usable reports for the coaches and the sports scientists and strength conditioning staff, etc. So we've now got a system, and I think a lot of you do as well, but where the GPS unit through training happens, the session gets returned to the doc and so on, they split the session, and as soon as it goes into GP Sports' account, it automatically gets sent across to Smartabase into a number of simple reports, such as these, that live within Smartabase, so we can just look at the simple, session by session, daily, weekly, the acute to chronic workload ratios, and even the raw data to have an idea of the load aspect of that model and what we're giving to each player. Then we also pump a number of things out into Excel so we can be maybe a little bit more agile and change things on the fly. And we're playing around with some of the more visual tools that we can look at some of this information across teams and programs. And Andrew at the front, he's working on a lot of that work behind the scenes. In terms of capturing information from our athletes, we don't have, because our sevens program is centralised and all the athletes that sit within our program are actually here full time in Sydney, we don't do our wellness information every single day. But when we're here at training, the players come in, jump on the iPads that are downstairs in the gym, they enter their information. One of the new features we've had recently is this compliance dashboard. We're always chasing players and you haven't filled in your wellness information and so on. That's been really helpful, just a red light, green light, and the players can keep themselves accountable. And that information goes directly into the system, as you know, but then a number of automated and semi-automated reporting functions happen to alert staff if there is anything that needs to be addressed before training happens. And that all happens in the 40 minutes between training. So we get text messages, alert, emails, goes through into some automated dashboards in the system. Just point your eyes to here is, just a really simple traffic light system around some of our information that we might want to look at. And then we also use a couple of Excel reports to put that information out and use some statistics, some magnitude-based inference statistics to determine whether or not the change we're seeing today is actually a change that we should act upon, or whether it's something that might be within their normal limits. So what we're looking at here is one of our objective measures of fatigue on a daily basis. So all it's comparing is the current score today to the last score of the athlete, giving us a likelihood or a chance that change is a real change based on that athlete's own history, not the group data. And then again, a traffic light system of potential risk, and we can make a decision. And again, Sam, it's a practitioner decision, not a decision modelling and all those kinds of things that we haven't got into just yet. But importantly though, in our decision-making process, we're not jumping up and down from a traffic light system from this. We're looking at it in the context of all the other information. So when we look at it, we don't just look at our groin squeeze on its own, we look at a number of trends from all our measures in the fatigue elements here, our soreness and wellness, our groin squeeze measures, and then also how the player is responding from a fitness perspective, not just a subjective response to training. So we're actually making a decision based on a number of factors rather than just relying on the one, if that makes sense. One of the other aspects that we're using some of the information here in this running and monitoring of training is we're starting to ask ourselves a few questions around not should we pull a player out of training or should we adjust what they do on that particular day, but more of a concept of player readiness. Okay, so changing the frame in which we look at some of our monitoring data and actually going, well, okay, can we use it to indicate whether our players are ready to perform? So rugby sevens, if you're unaware, we don't operate in week-to-week sport. We operate in generally 4 weeks of training and then 2 back-to-back tournaments somewhere around the world, and then another 4 weeks of training back home and then another back-to-back tournament. So it's a little bit more of similar to, I suppose, a track and field type sport where you can do some real loading cycles and then try to taper in for a tournament. So some of the ways we are using this information, if you look at the first 6 or 7 values on the top left here, this is charting flight time, contraction time from our weekly counter jump. So quite a robust measure of fatigue state or neuromuscular state. You can see this is the start of our pre-season, bit of an expected response after 6-7 weeks of loading. They actually are a little bit more neuromuscularly fatigued, as expected. But then we can look at this retrospectively at points through the season or at the end of the season and go, okay, did we get our tapering strategies correct? And so if you look to where the yellow highlighted weeks are, looking to see, is there a bounce back in the groups, this is group data, not individual, in the group's neuromuscular status. So again, have we got our tapering right into this tournament or this group of tournaments? If not, we can adjust and look at later on. One of the things that we can use this information for is, as you see through the start of our season, it's a little bit more variable as we are more focusing on some fitness changes and loading our players. But towards the back end of the season, where we are almost trying to maintain fitness and doing less total volume of work, we're having less fluctuations in what we see, but still a similar, following a decrease in neuromuscular state post the loading week and then a bounce back pre-tournament. So again, flipping the context of looking for risk of injury or risk of not being available for training and looking more from a performance perspective for monitoring our training. One of the things that we're really delving into with Mitch, our PhD student who looks after our GPS data, is comparing what we're doing in training to what's actually occurring in matches in those worst cases. Well, because we really want to know, are we preparing them for this, which is game day in front of 50,000 people in Cape Town, where they're actually going to perform at 185 metres per minute or higher multiple times across a weekend. Just before we get into the next couple of slides, it's important just to kind of disclaimer here, not every single training drill is looking to get these intensities of match play, okay? So we're going to walk you through a little bit of a story here around how we can analyse our training data in comparison to match play. So first thing in all these graphs, the very first column on the left is our game peak values, so the average, and then with the standard deviation, confidence limits there. The green dotted lines across is where the majority of our worst case scenarios are occurring in match play, so it's 145 to 185 metres per minute. And the dotted red line at the top is our absolute worst case scenarios that actually occur frequently. They're not the absolute maximum, but they do occur frequently in match play. The next 7 or 10 columns, they're a whole lot of our key intensity training drills. So the drills that we are focusing on having a physical stimulus as well as the tactical. On the far right is the average of a lot of conditioning. So a high intensity interval training, so 15 straight line, 30 straight line, so on, as a reference point to what kind of meters per minute we can achieve in those types of training activities. So, are we preparing our players for worst case? Please look at the second and the fourth column. We've got 2 main drills that we often perform, one being offside touch, which is we play at full field, 7-on-7, 5v5, normal rules, ball goes back first and then it can go in any direction. So it's more of a conditioning based game as opposed to a true tactical game. And then the fourth one there is a drill we call plug defence, which is in a smaller area, more like 60 by 70, and it's way more of a technical drill for defensive purposes, but has a really good physical stimulus. So if we look at these 2 drills, we'd say, right, they both provide us with a really high meters per minute stimulus to worst case, which is above what's occurring in a match. So we think, okay, they're good drills for getting the physical intensity that we want to see. But what about the high intensity running demands? So if we then look at percentage very high speed running, we start to see a little bit of a different story. And as you can see with that game peak periods, there's a huge spread and there are those key moments with enormous high intensity running. Offside touch and plug, we start to see a few differences there where the offside touch is a little bit more of a continuous game with less high intensity running, whereas a plug drill has more high intensity running. And we start to go, okay, if we want to combine both meters per minute and high intensity running percentage, maybe our plug drill is a good option. Then we start to get into the acceleration and deceleration demands of our game and what are our drills providing there. We were getting a lot of accelerations in our offside touch initially, and we thought we were getting a lot of accelerations in some of our other drills there onto the right hand side. But what it really showed us was we were under preparing our players for the acceleration demands with these key drills. But again, the plug drill is quite a good acceleration drill. Deceleration wise, very similar trends to the accelerations. Something again we thought we were doing a good job of, but we weren't. And then offside touch is even more glaring how continuous the game is opposed to aggressive changes in velocity. Before I move on into seeing what we look at from a heart rate perspective and what we get from our drills, the third column there is a 7v7 reference drill. So that's our tactical drill where we're not putting, or we have less emphasis on the physical targets for that drill. They're just technical and tactical training. Just note, with our 7v7 tactical drill, if we look at it, is it comparing or is it preparing us for meters per minute intensities in games? It's below games. It's below from a high intensity running perspective. It's not too bad from an acceleration perspective, but it's below from a deceleration perspective. So the questions we start to ask there, we can use this information around monitoring our training, is if we're just doing tactical drills, what do we need to supplement to make sure we're preparing the players for the game? So we move on to some heart rate data. So this is the peak heart rate percentage. What we start to look at, and we see that most of our drills are actually have a very similar heart rate profile to matches from both a peak and an average heart rate percentage. So maybe what we're seeing there is that for rugby drills, heart rate data is perhaps not a good discriminatory factor for identifying intense versus non-intense drills. So if we drill further down and we start to try to really understand the differences between our drills, so if we compare just the plug drill to the offside touch drill, we do this behind the scenes again just to try to really understand what we're getting with each drill and the shape of the data across a range of metrics. And what we've got at the top left is metres per minute, percentage very high speed running to the right. On the far right over there, accels and decels, and then our heart rate data underneath. And this is where you can really see some marked differences between those drills. And the metres per minute is very similar, but really some big difference in the acceleration and deceleration demands. And if we look at from a plug drill to a game perspective, we start to see, as the column charts did show us, the plug drill seems to be quite a good drill to get the physical conditioning that's required for the worst case scenarios of a game. Very similar metres per minute, if not a little bit more, similar high intensity running demands, and similar acceleration and deceleration demands. Again though, comparing now, if we go to offside touch to a game, where we can see those differences, and the blue dots are the game values, we can see offside touch, which we thought was a very good conditioning game, really did under-prepare the players for the acceleration and deceleration demands. And to further highlight that point around a 7v6 tactical drill, if that's all we do in training, going to be very similar from a metres per minute and high intensity running perspective, but it's not going to be where we need to be for accelerations and decelerations. So as part of our monitoring of all our training in this whole kind of cyclical process we go through to understand our game, plan training and see what we get from it, we also do behind the scenes some player availability and injury surveillance reporting. A lot of this is probably more of interest to see what we do across all of Rugby Australia here. So we have some systems set up to record information quite quickly. Details such as this, we can look at total injuries, match versus training, top injury locations, things like that. So we can pull out across programs, across years, some of our injury data. So obviously really useful for practitioners. We can just pull it out at any time in the season and know where we're at for a given period. But importantly, we can compare between programs. And then if we look at what we think in the sevens program is just as important as the injuries, is our player availability. We also do some stuff behind the scenes looking at how much our players train versus their overall availability to be selected in a tournament. And we track some information across time. And this is not this year's data, this was last year's data, even though it does say this year's data, I apologise. We start to see where the coach didn't have many decisions to make. 13 guys go on tour, and if we look at the third column there, there's only 16 players available, so he made 3 decisions from a selection perspective that tournament. Whereas later on in the year, where we might have 21, 20 available, so he's making 6, 7 decisions. And then we also use that information just to drill down and provide individual statistics, mostly more from a management perspective, i.e. contracting decisions, where we can look and say, right, who are our robust players? And we just, raw data there so that we can have a few conversations that, over a number of years or whatever, we start to see these guys who can tolerate the requirements of sevens and those that can't. You'll see maybe the process that we go through around getting some decisions around training and trying to inform us, not just from whether or not a player should train or not, but really trying to link and integrate what's actually happening in a game to the planning, and then to actually assessing what we did do and whether it was close or above what we do in games.